My name is Kristen, and I'm the Director of Operations here at GMI. I'd like to welcome everybody to our roundtable today on how to handle a career change. We're going to spend about an hour discussing this topic. As a reminder, we'll record this call, so it will be made available to YouTube after the fact. We're joined today by two repeat GMI mentors, Keilah and Philip, who will introduce themselves and share a bit about their career journey. Then we'll move into the questions that were submitted from our GMI mentees for this topic. If throughout the meeting you have any additional questions on career change, please feel free to type them in and we can address them at the end. Keilah, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm Keilah Roberts. I am a Customer Success Account Manager at Microsoft. I've been a GMI mentor. I think this is for about 2 years now. So I'm very excited to about today's topic and to meet some of you.
Philip?
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Kristen, for inviting me, and Keilah, great to be on this roundtable with you. So I've been a GMI mentor for probably 2 or 3 years, between 2 and 3 years. It's been a very rewarding experience. I currently have my own business doing a lot of coaching and mentoring. Prior to that, I spent about 35 years in information and communications technology. Gave that up about 2 years ago. And prior to that, I worked in human resources management.
Thank you both for sharing a bit about yourselves and your career so far. We're going to move into the questions that were submitted. And I think one of the overall questions that people had were, are you currently working in a field that is unrelated to your college major? Most of our students are in college, so I think they're starting to think about the future. Keilah?
Absolutely. Definitely working in a career that has nothing to do with what I went to school for. So before I answer that question and add additional context about where I am, I did want to mention team for the college students that I think it's really important to be open when it comes to your career. And although you might be studying something and gaining a skill in college, I think it's always, very important to be open to experience and opportunity, right? And so along the lines of taking my own advice here, my undergraduate degree is in social science, where I focused on political science. I always knew I wanted to go to law school. So once I graduated from college, I moved to the DC metro area from my hometown in upstate New York, Rochester, and took 2 years off to work to make sure it's something that I, absolutely wanted to do. Law school takes some preparation, right? Because you have to take an entrance exam. So I spent those 2 years working and preparing. So I ended up going to law school. And, once I graduated, I worked about 2 years in the field. And then this opportunity at Microsoft became available to work with law firms, right? So I had practiced for about a year. My first job out of law school was working for a judge. They were great experiences to help me understand and realize that I didn't really like being in law necessarily, right? I think it was great timing that the opportunity became available at Microsoft, working in technology. And so this is what we call a JD Advantage job, where having a law degree is helpful, right? Because understanding the customer's business is key to this role. So yeah, that's kind of like my backstory in terms of not necessarily working in the field that I have a degree in, but there are some underlying underpinnings in terms of experiences and being able to understand the customer's business when it comes to law.
Philip, what about you?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe I'll answer the question in the context of where I spent the majority of my career. So my first, qualification came from going to human resource management school. That was back in India, where I grew up. And when I had the opportunity to immigrate, I decided to retool and change careers. So I made a conscious choice to do that. Went back to school, got a degree in computer science, and from there ended up working in IT for a while, and then in managing critical environments over the years, or test environments as we call them. So very much different. Most of my career was spent in an area very much different from human resource management, which incidentally, I spent about 6 years in India working in that space. So it wasn't just a quick change, it was after a fair bit of time. And again, like Keilah just said, I did realize from my first career that that was not where I wanted to continue to be. It was a very taxing and stressful kind of environment to be working in. And so technology again became for me much more appealing. Um, that's where I ended up spending most of my time.
Thank you. So I guess you sort of both already touched on this, but was there a specific moment that you can pinpoint where you knew you needed to change careers, that you're making this next step and that you were like, I think this is what would be best for me? So Philip, you mentioned that it was part of when you were moving. Was there anything else about that, about why you wanted to switch careers at that point?
Yes, it was a tough decision. My priority was to move to the US, but I realized very quickly that my skills and experience would not easily transfer, given that the training I'd had and in the environment I worked in was very different in India. It was a different kind of economic situation. The social environment was different. The laws were different, and as we know, human resources is often there's a lot of governance, some much more so in India than in the US. But again, very different ecosystem that one had to work in, and so I figured that besides wanting to change because it was not the most satisfying job for me at the time, it was because I realized that I would not be able to come to this country and then hit the ground running, if you will, in that same area, right? So that's what made me decide, whatever it would take, I would need to do the retooling and retraining. Hope
Yeah.
that answers it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there was a particular moment necessarily, because with the practice of law here, usually people will tell you like, hey, like before you kind of make the jump out of this profession, to kind of like tough it out, so to speak, to like for at least like I think the rule of thumb is like 3 to 4 years so that you have enough experience. So like if you did want to parlay the degree into something else, that like you have those experiences. Um, but for me, this opportunity became available here at Microsoft. So I was like, oh, I mean, it felt like a once in a lifetime kind of thing. So I just decided to move. But I wouldn't say there was like any one experience that made me realize like, oh, I probably should do something else. Kind of similar to Philip here, like practicing law is very taxing, right? So I used to litigate, like go to court and stuff. I liked being a good advocate for my clients, but sometimes by the time that they reach you, they're in like such tough situations. By the time you get to court, it's really, really hard to like fight it out. So I had already been thinking about a career change, and then this opportunity became available. But kind of like I kind of did have in the back of my head, like, oh, is this the best move considering like that usual advice of um continuing to like practice, although it's not something that I super wanted to do. But I'm, happy to, have made the transition for sure.
So when you finally made the decision to kind of switch careers and you were about to make that next step, what were some of the fears or uncertainties that you had about this career change, that you kind of had to face? Keilah?
Well, it's for me for sure, it's very much quite a bit of a career change, right? Going from practicing law, which is something that is very I would say like, not to be negative, but kind of monotonous and very like practical, meaning like or the same every day because it doesn't change that often, and the law is the law is the law. So like, it is what it is. So like, what you're going to get up and face or argue when you go to court, or what a client might ask you about. So it's kind of monotonous in that way. But whereas this, like, I really didn't know like what to expect whatsoever. I mean, obviously technology um is a big deal and it changes so much, and so I was a little concerned about like, oh, like what is the expectation in terms of knowledge of technology, right? Because again, like not my background at all. I understand law and like how law firms work, right? And so those are the customers that I was assisting, But yeah, that probably was the scariest part because I didn't know what to expect on a day-to-day. And I learned very quickly, like, you kind of have to be on your toes in terms of like not only the expectation, but because my role is customer facing, what customers are looking for when they ask about things. So I would probably say like just having zero knowledge or understanding about like what you interview and like they tell you what to expect, but you just really don't know what, especially coming from a different industry, you know what I mean? So it was very scary for sure.
Was there anything that you did in that preparation to kind of overcome those fears, or was it once you're on the job, you're sort of starting to see it?
I would say both, right? So one of the things that I did like because what they do at Microsoft in this role is there is some ramp up. So the first 3 months I was learning and got quite a few certifications in Microsoft technology so that like I could have an intelligent conversation with customers about our technology, right? And so that was really cool, right? 'Cause I told myself, I was like, oh, if I can pass the bar, I can definitely figure this out. You know what I mean? So I was like, oh, like I mean, obviously it'll be hard, but I was like, okay, nothing is probably worse than this 3-day exam I sat through. So and it was actually fun to learn, right? So it was fun. So I was like, oh, this is like something interesting and new, and it changes so much. So that was really cool. So I spent 3 months like not only like getting the certifications, but shadowing folks that had been in this role for a long time. And that's really helpful. So I find that like for sure, just tips and tricks. Really important to like shadow someone and understand like how other people do things, so that like you can employ some of those practices. I thought that was super important. And then, just kind of trying to learn something new, which is huge at Microsoft. Like that's something that's very much celebrated is like we have a learn it all, not know it all culture. So nobody ever made me feel weird about asking questions and like always spending the time to learn something new. Those are things that I would probably say.
Philip, what about you? Did you have any fears or uncertainties, and then how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think the biggest fear, and I don't think it was just because I was moving from, halfway around the world, but the biggest concern was, financial independence, right? Because I had been getting a steady paycheck and I was financially independent for those 6 years that had worked in my first career. And so that was my biggest concern. And in coming over, I did have my sister who helped me, just make the initial transition. But I had actually made it my goal to become financially independent, as quickly as possible. And I'm happy to say that, I had one semester where I was, working for minimum wage and, just had to rely on help from the family. But by the second semester, I had secured two things. One was, a counselor position in the dormitory. So that gave me free boarding and lodging. And then I was also able to secure what in those days was called a graduate assistantship, right? So again, very competitive. You had to have very good grades. And so that always put a lot of pressure because you had to maintain this assistantship, you had to maintain the grades. But that gave me free tuition and a stipend in exchange for working about 20 hours a week on campus. So that first 6 months or so was extremely tough. But I think, for me, it was, single-mindedness of purpose. I made the commitment and I decided no matter what, I was going to find a way to make it work. And I think in hindsight, it was a blessing. It was also not, much like Keilah said, the concern, not concern, but there's always that the lack of confidence for me, at least, about jumping into a new field, right? A very technical field. This was in the early 80s, and so it was, not where computing is today. It was still kind of new and felt challenging. But again, I had a strong math background from going through university earlier, so that kind of helped me get through the tough courses and kind of plow, through. It took me 3 years, 3.5 years of being back in school to get my second degree. So, but again, one has to be committed and stay the course, if you will.
What would you say the biggest challenges were that you incurred while you were switching careers? Now, Philip, I would assume one of your major challenges was you had to go back to school, but were there any other big challenges that you faced?
So I think a part of it was also, it was a cultural change for me, living on an American campus, getting used to, um, the American culture, which is quite a bit different from the Eastern Indian culture. I fortunately met some really, my roommate, he was born and raised here, so he kind of took me under his wing and kind of oriented me to getting used to the way of life on campus, and we ended up finally rooming off campus, and that really helped me adapt, if you will, right? And then also having family here was great, because my sister lived a couple of hours away from campus with her family, and that was kind of like a home base for me. So that kind of support structure really helped alleviate a lot of the concerns, and got me through, I think, that tough transition period.
And Keilah, what about you? What were your biggest challenges, would you say? I know you mentioned like it's a completely new field, so you kind of had to learn the technical side of things, but what else would you say if there was any?
I would say that's probably the biggest, and probably the most important, right? So that was like a right. I would for sure like it because the biggest challenge for sure was being able to understand the technology, because my role is customer facing. So what I'm responsible for is technology adoption for law firms. And so I think at least twice a day, someone would ask me a question. I would have no idea what they were talking about. And so that's kind of scary, right? Because customers are investing in Microsoft, and like they're expecting me in this role to know, like, hey, like, can you point us in the right direction, or at least point out a resource that can help us, right? And so I spent a lot of time, and this is how you learn, by the way. So it's a challenge, but also an opportunity, right? To kind of like dig in and explore the areas, because as you all, I'm sure most of you all have used Microsoft technologies, but it's so vast. It's like you have to, I think, spend at least once a week just brushing up on what's changed, right? Because things change so much so quickly. And so just it was scary, obviously, somebody's asking you something, you're like have no idea like what they're talking about, but it forced me to kind of employ some skills I already had, right? Which are asking the right questions to the right people to get the answer, right? And then also to research, right? So one of the most important things I learned as an attorney, or like, going to law school, was how to look something up, right? Really, really important. And also to not being afraid to ask questions. Like, I'll be the first one to tell a customer, hey, no, I really don't know the answer to that question, but I will definitely get back to you, before the end of the day, or like set some deadline, and of course follow through with whatever time constraint that I set for myself. And people usually appreciate that. But I think it was definitely a challenge, but also an opportunity, right? Because it definitely forced me to kind of stretch myself in terms of like learning something new.
And then you just kind of touched on this, Keilah, but were you able to identify transferable skills from your previous job to your new job? And if so, how did you kind of go about identifying those?
Yeah, so I would say they kind of found me. And by that I mean like I'm like, oh, like because I think at first like glance somebody would say like, wait, how did you, transition from going to court every day or like every other day to like into this role? But it makes sense because I understand their business, and Microsoft is, selling technologies to customers. So you would want somebody in the seat to understand how people are using, or how attorneys are using their technology. So I would say the transferable skill for sure, research. I would say the other one is just being able to like understand a client and like their needs. Right. So as an attorney, I spend all day understanding a problem first before I can fully understanding a problem. right? And picking out the legally significant facts that will help me with the defense, right? So I used to defend people from eviction. So like just listening to what they're saying so that like I can come up with a defense for them. That's the same, very similar to what I do in this role in terms of understanding a customer's problem and how to align Microsoft technology or resources to help them support their business need, right? So like listening very closely and asking the right questions, understanding who on our side can help them. I think that's an important one. I think last, I'll say probably a really important skill is being a good advocate. So because Microsoft is so big, juggernaut of a company, when it comes to aligning resources or helping a customer, it's very important to be a good advocate internally because there's literally hundreds of customers that might have the same issue or they need help with the same item. So you really need to be able to hone in on why this particular issue or customer needs X, Y, and Z's attention now, right? And so I, used to go to court and advocate for clients to help, convince a judge or whoever why my client needs the relief or why we're asking for what we're asking for, right? So I think being a good advocate was, something that was transferable and, transferable from practicing law to this field. I hope that made sense, but yeah, please feel free to ask any questions.
Yes, it did. Philip, what about you? Were you able to identify
Sure.
transferable skills?
Yeah, there was some aspects that were transferable training that I had received. So when I did my first degree back in India, I had to do a research project, so I had to study statistics, and like I said, I had a solid grounding in math and logic, and those were very important for adapting to studying the study of computer science, right? And as I finally got into in an engineering position in a space, my first position was actually a customer facing. It was a support helpline kind of position. So besides needing to be proficient with computing technologies and helping users, the skills that I had learned as a human resources person, including being a very good listener, much like Keilah said, you had to listen really well to figure out what the issues were that users were having so you could come up with the most expeditious sort of solution for them. Being able to work in a team, because very often, especially if we had to handle an outage in the IT centers, we would marshal together and work, cross organizationally to restore services as quickly as possible. So that again was something. It was kind of a soft skill that I had learned when working in my first career. And even though our users were all internal, they expected kind of service much like you would as a customer of any kind of service, right? And so having that customer management skills, when you're in a crisis, the whole network is down and people are clamoring for restoral, being able to manage those expectations as you're trying to recover and restore service, all those skills were something that I found my earlier career had helped build to be able to work through in this new area that I was in. Just a few examples. Sure.
Thank you very much. I think that's always a concern when someone's trying to switch careers, like how much do they have to change or how much do they sort of already know given their previous job. One of the other most often questions about this topic that I received was sort of like how to adapt to your new environment. I think when you make that move to go somewhere new, you're in this brand new environment, and how do you handle things like that? Like Keilah, I imagine Microsoft is a much different environment than a law firm. So how did you learn to sort of adapt to that?
Definitely. So practicing law, right, is quite serious, right? And not that Microsoft isn't, but it's very much, it's much more like fun and I don't know if the word's collegial, but it's like it's just very different in terms of culture wise, right? So like with practicing law, like obviously like it's we're pretty strict about our time and like, the subject matter that we're talking about. At Microsoft, it's pretty fluid. And it's probably more fun. Like, for example, like if you'll notice, like I usually come to customer calls or meetings sometimes and I'm not like super dressed up, right? Obviously going to court, like you have to be, dressed up pretty to the nines. And so it's kind of like fun and interesting here that like, everybody's pretty relaxed. Obviously things are more serious at a law firm, but in terms of adapting, I think it's probably easier for me than like I think most other career transitions, just because I'm going from a high stress, significantly more structured environment to one where, obviously things are structured, but they're much less so. Also, too, like in this role, we kind of think of it as like kind of running our own business because we have a portfolio of customers and it's up to us about in this role up to us in terms of like how we run that business or like how we meet the customer's needs or how often we meet with them. And so it's entrepreneurial in that way, whereas law is definitely not like that. So adjusting, it was like fun and interesting to me. It wasn't stressful at all because I was going from like a significantly more like stricter and like, more structured environment. So it was probably more fun and interesting than anything.
And Philip, what about you? How did you handle adapting to a new
Yeah,
environment?
as I was listening to Keilah, I was kind of thinking my kind of journey was kind of a little bit opposite, where I was going from a less structured career, if you will, to one that had a lot of process around it, right? And so one of the great things that happened was, with the company that I first worked for, they had assigned a mentor to you right away as soon as you joined as a new hire, to just get you through, right? How to handle the process, to help you quickly come up to speed and make sure you were doing things, by the book as far as possible. How to take care of handoffs from, upstream groups in the process, as well as to do, clean handoffs to downstream groups in the process. And so the mentoring part was very important, to be able to quickly come up to speed for that. It was good that, the management allowed you some degrees of freedom because, as we all know, if you just do everything by the book, sometimes it's very difficult to get things done. But I was fine with that because it gave me a chance to be creative and be able to be very solution oriented, especially if the book didn't have the answer, if you will, or if the process didn't have the answer. So I think that was, it was a change. I didn't find it too stressful. It was just that if you couldn't get back with something fast enough, there were always people around you who were ready to help. It was, very much a team spirit that was constantly fostered because the end goal was to make sure the user was happy, or if a group was, out of dead in the water because of some technical issues, that you were able to get them back on as quickly as possible.
And then the last question is GMI puts a lot of not pressure, but a lot of emphasis on networking. And like we are always trying to say that creating a strong network is going to help you find a job. So how important of a role did networking play in your transition? Because if you're going to a new company, did you know people already? Keilah, did you know people at Microsoft and that's how you found the job? Or how did networking help you change careers?
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing people definitely helps. And one thing that I emphasize to my mentee too is not just networking to get the job, but it's networking to keep the job and get the next job, right? And so I think that's something that's like very important, not only for like I mentioned getting the job, but also too like when you get there that like you're always consistently having conversations and thinking about the next thing. And quite honestly, it's like a second part-time job if you're doing it right. So Microsoft is a big place, right? And so a lot of times like when jobs get posted, I usually people probably have in mind who not every single time, but like there's a lot of like conversations that are probably already been had, right? And so you want to definitely get in on the know and like know the people who are making the decisions. And so like I think when I first started, in addition to like learning my job, was spending a lot of time getting to know the people in my peripheral, like the management, like people in other areas, just in case like, oh, like this job is great, but like what does the next thing look like? And I think when it comes to like careers, it's very important to be like very much in control and like thinking about what the next thing might look like. Obviously having good relationships with the people that are around you is important, but again, like I mean, I think if you're, networking correctly, I think it really is like a second part-time job. Like I think spending at least an hour or two a week to get to know other people in areas like that you don't know about, super important. And then the last thing I'll say is like, I think also making authentic connections, that's really important. Like, right. I know people use networking as like the buzzword, but I like to call it authentic connection, right? Because I can't tell you, I'll be honest, like how many times I've networked with somebody and it was like awkward or like the conversations are hard because like my personality is different than theirs, or I can tell there's no alignment, right? And so like leaving those conversations, although they're hard, I mean, at least I'm honest with myself about like, okay, maybe this isn't the best networking opportunity because I didn't have an authentic connection with this person, right? And so I think searching for those like ways to connect with people, which not about work, really helpful, right? I mean, obviously we all work at Microsoft, but like I mean, finding a commonality that has nothing to do with work is really helpful in building, I think, that authentic connection. Despite sometimes like not, always feeling like like networking is working for you.
And Philip, how important was networking for your transition?
Um, for the transition in itself, yes, it did play a part, because as I mentioned, when I went to look for that graduate assistantship, it was through my sister's network that I was able to, find or navigate the way into the position. So I was starting cold kind of thing when I was here. But in terms of landing the first job after I finished my program, it was definitely through my colleagues at the university, right? That came back. After we graduated, everybody went their own way. I decided to work at the university for a while, and then a couple of guys who had gone to classes with, reached out a couple of years later and said, hey, we're hiring, and this was with Nortel. It was a big telecommunications company at the time. I was ready to make the move, from the university into industry. So absolutely, it was, old colleagues, colleagues I had gone to classes with that facilitated that connection, right? Because they had been working for a couple of years already with the company, and so it really eased my way to, finding getting in front of an interviewer and a recruiter and actually landing a job. And I just can't stress enough, to just reinforce everything Keilah said. It's just so important to build relationships, and meaningful ones, like you said, Keilah, not just for the sake of increasing your count on LinkedIn or whatever, but it's got to be meaningful. It's got to be something that you've shared in common. And it's amazing how even many years later you remember someone you worked with that can help with something else that you might be doing, right? Whether it's looking for a new position, or anything even outside of that, right? Where you're just trying to make business connections, the scope gets very different. But all those contact points that you made, I think, are invaluable. And even with your old faculty, right? When you leave, just staying in touch, especially if you've done some meaningful projects, in academia, old supervisors in previous companies that you worked with, right? And just co-workers, or folks that you interacted with in different departments, that you've been able to, make contacts with every single, and these days we have those platforms that makes it easy. You don't have to, build a Rolodex of business cards anymore. You just do it electronically. And so it's the facilities are there, the ease of doing it is there, and it's important not to pass that up.
So those were our submitted questions, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask that or say that changing your career can be pretty daunting, but sometimes it can lead to something that is much better for yourself. Is there any parting words of wisdom or advice you would give when it comes to kind of making that move to change careers? Philip?
Sure. So I think we've talked a lot about, what I call voluntary career changes, right? And those are the ones that, one is kind of built up preparation for and has a commitment to, and, one goes for it, without any, anything to hold you back besides some of the things we talked about. The involuntary ones, I think, are the toughest ones, and one should always be mentally prepared for that occurring. And by that, what I mean is, businesses change, economies change, uh, personal situations change. Very often, one is forced to consider a career change, even though one wasn't ready for it or one didn't want it, right? And we, I've been through many of these. Fortunately, not too many for myself, but where I've had to help people go through those. And some of the biggest challenges I've seen for people who have to go through an involuntary career change is being able to reinvent themselves. Let's say, you're a software programmer. That's your identity. We all become what we work for, right? And that very much becomes a part of our identity. And if all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out and suddenly there's no jobs for programming, um, one can't be stuck on just looking for that kind of job because they're not going to be there, right? So one has to have done some preparation or have a fallback plan to be able to reinvent oneself to say, okay, I'm now going to go sell real estate, right? Even though I did software programming or whatever, right? But it's important to think through and think back to all the things that you've done. It could have been your first job. For me, it was pumping gas, right? For someone else, it could have been working in retail. For somebody else, it could have been who knows, right? But it's very important to prepare for that possibility, right, of having to do that reinventing, that retooling, just to get back on your feet, because it's a tough one. You get knocked off your horse, and it's sometimes it's really hard. So I call it, I wrote down over here, I said there's 3 R's that you want to remember, right? When that happens, when an involuntary situation comes up. And one is to be resilient, right? So you have to find a way to jump back in the game and then reinvent yourself, right? And part of that reinventing means doing some rewiring. And what do I mean by rewiring is, you know, self-education. you know Besides connecting, there's another 4th R, reconnecting with your contacts to see if anybody can help out. But make sure you don't get stuck in that field that you spent 5 years in, and all of a sudden it's just not, it's not a booming field anymore, right? So that's just a thought I wanted to leave the audience with.
No, thank you. And that was certainly something that hasn't been touched. So the when you're kind of forced to make the career change, how can you kind of mentally handle that?
Right.
Keilah, anything else that you would like to say is kind of like your parting wisdom?
Well, first, that's hard to follow. I wish you would gone second. I don't even know what I'm gonna say. I would say so, just kind of in line with Philip, but like 2 points, right? Networking, don't wait until you need something to start networking or asking people for stuff, right? You want to have all your connections very much warm, right? So it's not like, oh, you're, contacting me because you need something. It's like, no, a friend reached out to me for help, right? Like, see how those things are different, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, when you're making those authentic connections and keeping them warm, it or keeping them warm appropriately, it should always feel like the latter. Like, I'm reaching out to a friend because I need assistance, not making the other person feel like, oh, you're reaching out to me because you need or you want something suddenly, right? So that's why I'm saying, if you're doing it right, you're spending at least an hour or two a week. Maybe that's a little aggressive, but you're spending some time um developing those relationships because they're important. But just kind of like aside from that, I would say when an opportunity presents itself that isn't something I think that's like normal course or something that like you've been advised to do, I'd say I jump in 2 feet head like first into it, because you never know like what you can get out of an opportunity. I know when I was transitioning into this role at Microsoft, a lot of people were asking me and very concerned, like, oh, why would you like spend all this time and money going to law school and then kind of just like leave the profession so quickly? And I'm so glad I did. This is the best job I've ever had, right? So much happier overall with this career opportunity. And so like I think, again, like I was saying in the beginning, I think being very open to experience, and then when opportunities like ones that like you probably wouldn't normally go for become available, to just jump in, like, right. You have, I think one life to live, but like when it comes to professional life, I mean, I think it's important to like seize the opportunity when they arise.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. I know I certainly learned a lot about career change, and so I appreciate your time. If anybody on the call has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you both so much for your time, and I hope you have a great evening.